You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. April marks the 6-month anniversary of the Hamas attack on Israeli settlements, and in the months since, Israel has consistently bombarded Gaza. According to the latest reports, over 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, and tens of thousands more are missing or injured. For now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is rejecting pleas for a ceasefire, and his military is proceeding with plans for a ground invasion of Rafah, where more than 1 million civilians are sheltered. October 7th may become a consequential event in modern American political history, especially for candidate and President Joe Biden. Immediately after the attacks, President Biden signaled his support of Israel, but he warned against Israel conducting a ground offensive and a wider occupation of Gaza. While behind the scenes, Biden's operatives have attempted to dissuade escalation, his administration has come short of openly admonishing Netanyahu. But the political winds on Israel may be shifting. With Biden slipping in the presidential polls, Chuck Schumer recently criticized Netanyahu in a speech from the Senate floor, and the Democratic Senate leader charged the Israeli prime minister with impeding the peace process in the Middle East. The violence in Gaza has put Biden's electoral hopes on a knife's edge. But just how risky is it for the Democrats to change their tune on Israel? Zack Beauchamp is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers challenges to democracy in the United States and abroad, right-wing populism, and the world of ideas. That this is even a beat in 2024 tells you something about the times. Beauchamp was the longtime host of Worldly, Vox's weekly podcast on foreign policy and international affairs. He's appeared on MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, Al Jazeera, and now on Shifting Ground. Welcome.
Hey, thanks, Ray, for that lovely intro.
Zach, you recently wrote an article called "Are Biden and the Democrats Finally Turning on Israel?" I know writers don't always write headlines, but the casual passerby could see that turning in two ways, one ominous, one merely directional. Turning as in changing their opinion, or turning on Israel as if reversing course and coming at him?
So I think I intended it, because this time I did play a role in writing the headline, more along the lines of the former than the latter, right? What I was trying to communicate with turning is that since the October 7th attacks, the Biden administration and the mainstream of the Democratic Party has been very solidly behind Israel's war effort inside Gaza, seeing it as a just war of self-defense after the horrific terrorist attack by Hamas on that day. And the U.S. has been Israel's leading supporter internationally. It's been its leading provider of arms. Without American support, Israel would have significant difficulties operating for this extended period of time at a full war footing. So it's fair to say the Biden administration has been integral in continuing or enabling the continuance of Israel's war effort. What's different now in the past few weeks is that they clearly have gotten fed up with the way that Israel has been conducting itself, and specifically the way that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been conducting himself. And there are a variety of different reasons for this, but I mean, the most prominent example of this tension going public happened a week after I published that article, which is Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer publicly calling for new elections in Israel, which basically is the second most powerful Democrat in the country saying that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu needs to step down. That's very rare. You never hear anything like that.
Well, let's take a closer look at that. Would Chuck Schumer, keeping in mind the traditional way in which they hoard the perquisites and the privileges of separation of power and not wanting to give any of that away, would the Schumer operation have cleared that with the White House before he went public with that speech?
That's an excellent question. I am sure that they wouldn't have sprung it on the White House. Whether or not they would have given the White House a veto, that I'm not fully sure of, and I don't want to speculate about because I haven't heard anything from the sources that I have that can confirm or deny that. But I can say that they wouldn't have just gone rogue and done this without any warning. And so I think, if gun to my head or you're going to force me to speculate here, I think that this is an intentional warning shot by a coordinated Democratic Party trying to tell Netanyahu in no uncertain terms that the United States is not going to just do whatever you want. That the sort of blank check period of U.S.-Israel relations has come to an end.
I ask in part because the president, before too long, praised the Schumer statement and supported its main points. Did the New York senator create space for Biden to do that by making his statement?
Schumer, by the way, has a reputation, a longstanding, well-deserved reputation of being a very staunchly pro-Israel member of Congress. Not just Jewish, right there. I'm Jewish. Plenty of Jews are critical of Israel. Schumer has a reputation as a strong Israel supporter, right? For him to make a statement like this and to say that the Netanyahu government it's not quite what he said, but close enough, right? The current government is not serving Israel's interests. I mean, goodness, opening up space probably doesn't even begin to describe it, right? It's auguring a fundamental shift in the way that the United States could choose to handle its relationship with Israel during this ongoing war.
The president has gotten harsh criticism from both his left and his right since October. A lot of the critiques of the president's actions since October have struck me as like too facile by half, sometimes going out of their way to ignore the tight spot any American president is in when there's conflict involving Israel, ignoring the special challenge for a Democrat and the added challenge of it being an election year, as if it's been crystal clear from the beginning exactly how to proceed. And there are even people listening to this conversation right now, yelling at their radio or their phone or whatever listening device. Of course it was clear how to proceed.
Look, it's Israel. There are always people yelling.
Right. Okay. But have some of these critiques implied that it's easier to figure out just how to respond than it really is?
Yeah, like this is an immensely difficult policy challenge, and it's made more complicated by political and legal constraints about what Biden can do on his own. For instance, can he unilaterally suspend military assistance to Israel? Depends on who you talk to, and it depends on what Congress might do and what the situation is. So that's complicated in and of itself, and that's what many people have been demanding from his left. But I think there's some fairly straightforward criticisms of the Biden approach that I think are at very least reasonable, right? And one of them is that the basic logic of Biden's policy after October 7th was the common phrase is bear hug Benjamin Netanyahu, which is by so openly embracing Israel and taking its side and validating Israelis' feelings of terror, hurt, and anger about October 7th, that Biden would become seen as Israel's champion. And by and large, he was. In Israel, Joe Biden is currently more popular than both Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, who in turn was more popular than Barack Obama among Israelis. So Biden is, there are drawings in Tel Aviv, graffiti, of Joe Biden dressed up as Captain America that you can find, because that's the esteem with which Israelis hold him, given his response. He's often described in the Israeli press as somebody who, after October 7th, met the moment better than Netanyahu, who spoke as sort of conscience of the nation, the heart of the nation after that. That's a tremendous amount of goodwill that Biden has not cashed in. I really thought early in the war that what Biden was doing was setting up a policy that would give him leverage to constrain Israel from certain self-defeating and morally destructive behaviors. And so far, there's little evidence that he's been using his massive well of support, deep well of support with the Israeli population to try to force the government to shift course. Now, that might be changing, right? I've heard reports that Biden has asked permission to give a direct address to the Israeli people. If he does end up doing that, that's the kind of thing that he could do to tell them that the government has put them. I think this is increasingly the Biden position and the Schumer position, and I think it's correct, that the government has put them on a self-destructive path, to say nothing of a destructive path for the tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians who have died at this point and are likely to die in the coming months, especially with the starvation crisis in Gaza. So it's why that leverage hasn't been cashed in has been a real mystery to me, but I think we're finally starting to see it getting spent.
Well, for people who have been impatient with the Biden response, who have wanted the United States to pressure Israel harder, would they do well to remember that Biden's approach is, at least in part, shaped by the time in which he became a public figure, shaped by his era in politics, another era in this bilateral relationship?
Joe Biden has been in politics for decades now, and Israel has changed quite a lot during that period of time. And when Biden really entered American political life, uh, Israel was it didn't have this extraordinary system of control and entrenched degree of settlement in Palestinian life that it has right now. It was widely seen as a small, scrappy country that had barely survived several different attempts to snuff it out, which is not inaccurate, right? The Israeli history is always an extremely complicated question, and there are multiple different ways of viewing it that are all valid at the same time. The Palestinian perspective being they took our land, they kicked us out, and then they kept doing it more and more, and there's an element of truth to that too. These two things are not mutually exclusive, by the way. It's just that there is a zero-sum conflict over a certain area of land based on two competing nationalities' visions for self-determination and based on their own history and historical rights to particular territory. So there's always going to be different ways to spin these things. But in the United States, the sort of heroic narrative of Israel was really dominant, and there was more reason for that narrative to be dominant then than there is now. And Biden, I think, really personally clings to that idea of Israel in a way that often isn't quite caught up with events, right? With the way that things have changed, with Israel becoming the dominant military power in the Middle East, with very limited existential threats to its survival from external military aggression, right? Which was just not the case in the latter half of the 20th century. So the ground has shifted, and it's just not clear that Biden has shifted with it.
Since October, has Joe Biden had to do a certain amount of performative politics? Certainly since those first days when Israel was perceived as under threat and the victim of a terrorist attack. I mean, this is the same Benjamin Netanyahu getting bear hugged who showed up Vice President Biden by announcing construction of new Israeli settlements on the day Biden arrived in the country for a high-level series of talks. It's the same Benjamin Netanyahu who came to Washington to publicly speak against Obama administration efforts to reach a nuclear non-proliferation deal with Iran at the invitation of congressional Republicans. There's a history here, and Joe Biden, I guess, just hasn't publicly remembered it, though I'm sure he privately
Definitely does. Yeah. Yeah. I have no doubts about that. I mean, look, Benjamin Netanyahu believes his vision for Israel's future relationship with the United States is that the Democratic Party can't be relied on. The Democratic Party is increasingly left-wing in his view, and a left-wing American political party can't be trusted to maintain an ally of an Israel that's refusing to come to any kind of two-state solution agreement with the Palestinians, or even seriously take steps like curbing settlement development that could lay the groundwork for such a solution. Netanyahu, who opposes a two-state resolution to the conflict, believes that the best hope for what he wants Israel to be rests with an alliance with the Republican Party specifically. And it's been acting that way since at least 2012, when he all but openly campaigned for Mitt Romney in the presidential election. And, he's very close with Donald Trump while Trump was in office. They've had some disagreements recently publicly, but those disagreements, I think, don't speak to a profound difference in worldview so much as they do some kind of personal spats resulting from Netanyahu recognizing Biden's victory as a legitimate victory, which he had to do as Israel's prime minister. But that means that Netanyahu has no interest in doing things that are designed to curry favor with a Democratic president, right? He thinks that he can outlast Biden, and he can wait for Trump to come back in 2025, and that hopefully, from his point of view, he'll still be in power then, and he can basically have a free hand to do whatever he wants.
So Benjamin Netanyahu is running the Vladimir Putin playbook?
Yeah, basically, yes. Yes. It's not different at all. They both have gambled on the same thing. I mean, look, at least in the Israel case, you can understand ideologically, socioculturally, why it is that the Republican Party has become a hardline supporter of the Israeli far right. With Putin, it's much more confusing, right? With Republicans having a longstanding history of conflict with Russia. But, the Republican Party is a party of white evangelicals, and there's no group in the United States that is more staunchly pro-Israel, more supportive specifically of the Israeli right than evangelicals, right? They're far more hardline pro-Israel. I don't even like the term pro-Israel, right? Because it's not about supporting the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. It's about supporting a particular vision for Israel that Netanyahu has come to embody, a sort of right-wing vision that never compromises on territory. And American Jews, by and large, don't support that vision, right? But evangelicals do. And so Democrats being the party of something like 70 to 80% of Jews, depending on the given election year, and Republicans being the party that's its base is white evangelicals, you understand Netanyahu's gamble a little bit more.
You've set the table beautifully for 2024 electoral concerns. What is the risk that Biden runs in criticizing Israel this year?
Well, so I think he's in a no-win situation politically as a result of the Gaza war. We've seen what his pro-Israel position has yielded in terms of backlash from the Democratic base and things like the Michigan uncommitted votes around the country, protests at Democratic Party events. It probably plays a role in Biden's unusually poor approval rating among young voters who are a reliably Democratic group and who also tend to have the most pro-Palestinian views. My guess is that the Biden team has made a calculation in part that they need to stem the bleeding on their left, right? Because otherwise they'll be missing a critical constituency in the general election. But if you veer too far in that direction, you risk alienating what I would say is a majority of Democratic voters who still have a relatively pro-Israel position. And by that, I don't mean a pro-Netanyahu position. Netanyahu is viewed extremely unfavorably by Democratic voters, or a pro-Israeli right position, but a general sense that Israel has a justified cause in responding to October 7th, which I think is the mainstream view among both Democrats and especially among Jewish voters. And if Biden goes too hard in criticizing Israel, he risks alienating this whole other constituency. So there's not like a way for him to wring political advantage from this. There's a way for him to thread this needle and make sure he doesn't lose voters on either end. But that's a very delicate dance. And at the same time, the politically best policy might not be the substantively best policy, right? The best way to bring the conflict to a close on terms that create the conditions for a longstanding peace. My own view is that Biden needs to be much harder on Israel, specifically on Netanyahu, than he has been in the past, in order to try to push for something that could break the logjam, the horrific logjam the Israelis and Palestinians were stuck in before this war, and to save Palestinian civilians, which is, I think, the most pressing concern given the situation of near famine going on in Gaza right now.
Do we have an idea at this point, now that we're many months into this conflict, of who among the senior officials at the tops of the various food chains, who has the president's ear when it comes to finding that balance between criticizing and not criticizing Israel, limiting the damage, but also limiting the damage literally on the ground in Gaza? Do we know who he listens to?
So my sense from reading accounts of people who are very plugged into what's going on in the White House is that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is really leading the charge on a lot of this stuff. And that Sullivan's vision is the one that he tends to influence the president to a fairly significant degree and plays a major role in setting national security policy. But the Secretary of State is also very important, right? It's his top officials. Biden, from what I understand, again, tends to have a hard core of people around him. And they feel like they have a history, especially the political people, of being dismissed. And then Biden ends up succeeding despite what the outside critics say. And so they tend to have a bit of an insular mindset. I don't know the extent to which that's true on foreign policy versus domestic policy. But I do think that there's a reason why they don't always shift policy very rapidly. Right. And part of it is that sometimes they think external critics just don't understand what they're doing. But we are belatedly seeing a shift. right? A shift and a more willing to openly criticize Israel direction. I mean, we saw it even at the State of the Union when Biden spoke about Israel almost like a hostile government in speaking directly to Netanyahu. And typically, when the way that he did that during that speech, where he singles out a foreign leader for criticism, even if it was indirect criticism, as it was in that case, that is typically reserved for countries the United States openly doesn't like. So while it was subtle in the speech, those of us who have steeped in diplomatic lingo knew exactly what was going on there. And that's a sign that it made it into the State of the Union, that Biden's inner circle is increasingly moving off from its initial stance.
Earlier, you referred to the non-committed vote in the Michigan primary. Is that really an opening salvo in what's likely to be a 2024-long campaign? Do Muslim and Arab American activists, voters, political people have the kind of muscle that it would take to sway other Democrats, progressives, to press Biden to change his stance on Gaza in a public way? Because I think the assumption has been all along that privately, I mean, Anthony Blinken can practically buy a co-op in Jerusalem at this point. He's flying back and forth so often that the administration has been pressuring Israel, but not publicly and to little discernible effect.
There's some discernible effect, right? I would credit any aid flow increase into Gaza to a significant degree as resulting from American pressure. So at the end of the initial siege, the full blockade on aid flows was to a degree also creditable to the United States, but clearly not enough, right? Clearly not enough is being done on that front. To your question about the politics of it, honestly, I just don't know. We've never seen this kind of concerted organization from the Muslim and Arab American communities to try to pressure a Democratic administration on Israel policy before. Nothing like these uncommitted votes. Do I know if that's making a huge difference in their calculation? No, I don't know that for sure. What I can say is that it's not necessarily the sort of narrow subgroup of Muslim American or Jewish American voters that the administration is concerned about. I think it's broader groups, and especially young people, right? That really, really gets to the Biden administration. Because if you look carefully at the polling, there's no doubt that Biden's weakness among young people is powering a significant amount of his polling problems right now. Biden is just doing unusually poorly for a Democrat with that demographic. And there's a lot more young people than there are members of religious minority groups, these particular religious minority groups in the United States. And so that is just a primary concern for any political campaign that's in trouble, like the Biden campaign is right now. And if there is substantial evidence that the Gaza campaign is driving these unfavorable ratings among young people, that's open to debate, right? It depends on how you interpret different poll results. But that constituency in particular, I think, is the real concern for them, the biggest one. And so that it'll be important to take a look going forward on how they perceive the 18 to 29 group and their actions and whether that's affecting their voting.
Zack Beauchamp is a senior correspondent at Vox. Take a look at his article, Are Biden and the Democrats Finally Turning on Israel? Thanks for joining us, Zack.
Thank you, Ray. I really appreciated the chance to talk.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Adam Ailey and Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.